Hello everyone, this is the first of two videos on the executive branch and the federal bureaucracy. We've covered the presidency, and now we're going to talk about this vast federal bureaucracy that the president is basically in charge of. And you may recall we've discussed the idea of delegation, that the president was basically delegated this sort of authority by Congress. Congress created the federal bureaucracy. They set up those agencies. They gave them their duties. They tell them basically what they're supposed to do and how, more or less, how to do it. But the bureaucracy has a lot of latitude, and it is ultimately under the control of the president. So that's what we're going to be talking about here. There are six main topics. Three of them we're going to cover in this video. First, what is bureaucracy, and how has the federal bureaucracy evolved over time to what it is today? And the third thing we'll cover is, a brief overview of what the federal bureaucracy looks like today. In the second video, we'll talk about bureaucratic accountability. How do we hold this unelected, unaccountable fourth branch of government accountable? We will talk about the rule-making process. In other words, the way these bureaucratic agencies create rules that have the force of law. And when we talk about regulation, that is what we are talking about, the rules they make that have the force of law. And that process is regulated in such a manner that they are supposed to be limited in what they can do. So we're going to talk about how that works, how that rulemaking process works, and so that they don't exceed their authority. And then lastly, we'll talk briefly about the politics of the federal budget. So that's where we're going here. First, Americans, generally speaking, distrust bureaucracy. And that's not true in all countries. There are many countries around the world, France is a great example, where people think that being a government bureaucrat is actually quite a respectable profession, and they're proud to have their children become government bureaucrats. But in the United States, we think of bureaucracy as a bad word. Well, it's just bureaucracy. We think of bureaucracy being synonymous with, inefficient, wasteful, stupid, absurd. I'd like to encourage you to think about this a little more deeply and not necessarily see it that way. Most people don't really know much about what the bureaucracy does. And you remember when the book, The Fifth Risk, by Michael Lewis, talks a lot about how little we know about the important departments of the federal government and the people within them, many of whom are scientists, who are doing things that protect us against risks. And it is reflected. American attitudes are reflected in this belief that the federal government is wasting more than state and local governments. It's kind of interesting. I mean, this graph shows you Americans' views on government waste by the federal government. This is a perception. This is not real. This is a perception that people have. That they think that the government is wasting 51 cents out of every dollar. The federal government, state government only wastes 42, and local government wastes 37. I mean, this is a very characteristic American attitude to think that government is wasteful, and it is not based on knowledge. It is based on things people have heard and things they hear politicians say. Some politicians like to bash government, but we'll learn a little more about this and hopefully begin to understand it in more detail. Common criticisms of bureaucracy, as I said, are wasteful, that they're deceptive, in hiding information, that they're corrupt. And people in the city of Chicago are accustomed really to government being somewhat corrupt, and it has been historically in the city and the county. Paternalism, people who think they know more than you do. And, I'd just like to encourage you to think a little more about this. I mean, why do we think this, and where's the grain of truth in it? It's important to understand that governments take over tasks where there's no profit to be made. I mean, the government does, if a private business corporation is going to take care of a particular task, to build something, to sell something, to do something, and it's just going to all be taken care of by a company getting set up and doing it, and then ordinary citizens paying for it. If that's all going to happen, well, we don't need the government to do it, do we? And so think about it. Government does things for the most part, where there's no profit to be made, and that's why it seems like they're inefficient. I mean, who's going to build and pay for the interstate highway system except government? No one else. You know. Now, these tasks, and we've talked a bit about this, and I'll show you another slide on this, public goods, etc. But just understand, then we're going to talk about how bureaucracies are organized, but it is in the nature of bureaucracies that they're difficult to supervise because they're big, they have lots and lots of employees, they have complicated tasks, and they're not easy to supervise. They depend to a substantial extent on the professionalism of the employees who work in the bureaucracies. I'm going to talk more about this, but brief refresher here. Remember we talked about public goods and private goods? Well, private goods, that the ones that you can exclude people from using, and the ones that if one person uses them, another person can't. We call them excludable and rivalrous. Private goods, well, look, we don't need the government to do that. Business corporations and buyers and sellers will buy and sell whatever they want in that realm. But look at the public goods. That's the issue. The important public goods, the things that everyone can consume. You can't prevent them from being consumed. You can't shut people out, breathing air and this sort of thing. Who's going to keep the air clean? What business corporation is going to do this? How are they going to get paid to keep our air clean? And the answer is they're not. And so, we've talked about this. I won't cover this again in detail because we did go over this. But, these public goods have an essential problem, which is that you can't make people pay for using them. Clean air, clean water, national defense, things of this sort. No one's going to do it unless the government collects the tax dollars to make people pay for it, and then the government does it. Otherwise, they won't get done. And the economy and our lives really depend on these things, many of these things being done. So, and that's why when the government shuts down, we all see, what it's doing. The government shut down when Trump was president from December 22nd, 2018 until January 25th, 2019. It was the longest shutdown of the U.S. government in American history, 35 days. Now, I just want to show you a couple of examples of what happened here. It shut down because Trump wanted Congress to fund his border wall, and Congress was resisting funding the border wall, so he said, I'm not going to sign a budget unless I get my border wall money. And so he let the government shut down. It ran out of money. The agencies ran out of money. So they had to stop functioning. 800,000 employees were not paid for 2 pay cycles. Now, eventually, they got back pay, but 1.2 million federal contractors did not get back pay. They just lost their money. Half of the 36,000 staff of the Federal Bureau of Prisons were put on furlough. The U.S. Coast Guard and the FBI and other law enforcement and national defense agencies, people just worked without pay. They just had to go to work and not get paid. We're talking about an enormous number of people. And then a few just examples. National parks were filled with garbage because nobody was staffing them. They were damaged. Trees were cut down at Joshua Tree National Monument by idiots who were just vandalizing things. I have some pictures of that I'll show you. Airline terminals were closed. Food safety inspectors stopped working. People who were, I'm just giving you some examples. People who had their, identities stolen couldn't notify the Federal Trade Commission of the problem. Housing and urban development, financial money to low-income tenants stopped flowing. The U.S. Geological Survey stopped providing earthquake data. All kinds of things happened. The immigration courts were shut down. If the shutdown had continued, the consequences would have been disastrous for people in this country. And that is why Trump backed down and signed the budget and let the government go forward, even though he didn't get the money he wanted for his border wall. He could not keep it up because even he, with his hatred of government, even he realized that disasters were occurring all over the country because he had shut down the government. Now, this is just pictures of what happened at Joshua Tree National Monument. I could have given you pictures of many, many, many things, but this is just particularly outrageous. When the staff finally got back on duty from their furloughs, they found that at Joshua Tree, now this is a species of tree that is quite special. And this is a beautiful place. And they found that somebody had just knocked down a tree with a car. Other trees had been cut down for firewood. There were vehicle tracks in places there aren't supposed to be cars. They found 120 illegal campsites with campfires. They lost $1 million in money in fees. The government loses money when it shuts down, actually, because people can use federal parks for free. They just walk in and use them. And basically people, were just pillaging and plundering and using the place. It's an example of what happened to one of the Joshua trees. I mean, I could show you pictures of prisons too, but all the other things that happened. But there you go. This is just one example of the many things they do. So now let's talk about bureaucracy. What a bureaucracy really is. There's the famous sociologist Max Weber, viewed often by many as the sort of inventor of, founder, so to speak, of the discipline of sociology. And he pointed out that bureaucracies have certain characteristics. And he thought, in his view, that bureaucracy is actually a good thing. His view was that bureaucracies are rational ways for a very complex society to get organized and to function. And he talked about how there are different ways of organizing a society. Some societies base authority on tradition, and others base it on what he called charismatic authority, which means personalities, people with strong personalities, particularly people, kings and authoritarian rulers. But he said, the best principle is really what he called a rational legal system of authority, where everyone lives under the law. And he said a society like that needs to be organized as bureaucracy. Meaning what? An organization with a chain of command or a hierarchy. Levels of authority. Division of labor, side to side, so to speak. So if you've seen an organizational chart, you know what I'm talking about, where an organizational chart, we'll look at a couple of them, has top and middle and bottom levels of authority, and then it has kind of columns where tasks are divided among different groups. And so these division of labor, chain of command, clear lines of authority and information flow. The agency has a goal. The organization has a goal. It's impersonal, meaning it treats everybody the same, regardless. And this is what many things that people don't like about bureaucracy are that fact, that it's impersonal. But according to Weber, that's actually a good thing. It treats everybody the same. And they're supposed to be productive. So if you take a department like the Department of Health and Human Services, they have a mission. The employees are qualified to do the job. They're dedicated to the mission, and so forth. So they'll have, like, within the Department of Health and Human Services, they've got the National Institutes of Health, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, etc., and budgets for the agencies and the departments that reflect their functions. So this is an example of what I mean by an organizational chart. This is the department in question. And you can see it has at the top a secretary, a deputy secretary, and levels of authority going down. And then it also has this specialization. It has within it division of labor among various offices and centers and sub-agencies all throughout it. And they all have their own functioning. And that's how a bureaucracy functions. That's what we mean by a bureaucracy. Hierarchy, chain of command, a goal orientation, professionalized staff, etc. I'm just using this as an example. We could use any one of the agencies of the federal government, but this is the point. This is the way bureaucracies are organized, and people often find this frustrating. You're in the wrong office. You have to go to a different office. The sort of thing you probably encountered this at UIC. Wait, you should be in a different office. Well, that's a function of a division of labor, and sometimes of hierarchy. You need to go up. You need to go down. But, and it is frustrating for all of us to have to put up with this, me too, all of us, but this is the way they're supposed to function, so that we know people are being held accountable for doing their job alone and not someone else's. This shows you the budget of the National Institutes of Health, which is part of the agency. And you can see when certain things happen. Some funding goes up, some funding goes down, but the point I'm trying to get across is that the funding of the agency is also specialized. It is also focused. Parts of the HHS budget go to certain functions, and that money goes to certain offices. That's the way it's supposed to work. So here's a pie chart that sort of shows some of the things they're working on: hemophilia, fetal sudden death syndrome, congenital heart failure, spina bifida, ADHD, muscular dystrophy, autism. You see, I'm just trying to get a. It's not that I want you to memorize this. I want you to understand that when people think of bureaucracies as being big and wasteful and bureaucratic, that's really not the situation. I'm not saying there's no waste. I'm not saying that. There is some waste, but the vast majority of money that is being spent by the federal government is specifically appropriated for particular things and can only be spent on those particular things. In this case, there was we're all familiar with what happened with vaccines for COVID, and before that, there was a push to develop a vaccine and also therapies for the Ebola virus, which is not a problem in the United States. It has never really come here, and maybe one or two people were flown in with the disease, but it's a terrible problem in West Africa, and there have been outbreaks of Ebola that have really caused public health disasters in Africa. And so, the director of the National Institutes of Health, Frank Collins, explained that, suddenly when we needed a vaccine for Ebola, oh my God, there's an outbreak in Africa. Where it turned out that for more than 10 years, the NIH had been working on developing a vaccine for Ebola, and people didn't even know it in the executive branch, but there it was. So, this is, once again, sort of like with the book, The Fifth Risk. Our government is out there protecting us against things, and we often don't even know what those things are. But there are scientists and specialists within these agencies who have certain amounts of money that are dedicated to certain things, and they're working away on those things all the time. So let's talk about where this bureaucracy in the federal executive branch came from. During the Federalist era, and now I'm talking about the founding of the country, 1787 on to about 1828, their thought, the Federalists, the people who sort of wrote the Constitution, they were basically rich white men, property-owning white men, who thought that it was an obligation of being a member of the social and economic elite to serve in government from time to time. And so they viewed public service as sort of a responsibility that they had to do. I'm not saying they did it well, or that they didn't help themselves. I'm not saying that. I am saying that was the way they viewed government service, a thing that people like George Washington should do to help the country because they're rich and famous and well educated and own property. So it was an obligation. It's basically a social class based notion of working for the federal government, that the upper crust, the upper class, they're the ones who should be running the government. Well, along came Andrew Jackson in 1828. We call this the Jacksonian era. And he and his people were very much against that. They said, government jobs, it's not special. They should be given out to the people who support you. And we call it patronage. Now, we in Chicago, we know about this, don't we? They used to call it the spoils system. You give the federal jobs to your staunch supporters, and the notion was anyone can do these jobs. Ordinary people can do these jobs. You don't have to be a George Washington. And then that gave way over time to something we call the merit system. And I'm going to talk with you about how this happened. And the way it operates today is that jobs should be based on ability. Federal work, and this holds true for state and local government employment too, but we're speaking of the federal bureaucracy. Merit, credentials, passing competitive exams, educational degrees, and previous job experience. That, we argue now, is the basis for government employment. And this has been regularized into something we call civil service, which is a much more complex rule-based system that was put into place following the assassination of President James Garfield in 1881 by a disgruntled job applicant. First, briefly, here's the first real federal scientist. A huge number of federal employees are scientists. And the first of them was John Wesley Powell, an amazing man. He was a soldier in the Civil War on the side of the Union. He lost an arm due to a cannonball, and he went right back into battle. He lost his arm early in the war and went back and fought the whole rest of the war with only one arm. He was what we would call today a geologist, but he was, at that time, he wasn't really formally trained. He educated himself as a geologist. He explored the American West. He was the director of the U.S. Geological Survey of the Smithsonian Institution, and eventually a professor at Illinois Wesleyan. And he sort of created the mold for the federal scientist. In 1869, he organized a 10-month exploration of the Colorado River to determine whether there was enough water in the Colorado River for farming in the West. This was extremely dangerous. There were no dams on the Colorado River at that time. They all came later. It was a roaring, dangerous task. Some of the men died. And he came back and with a study that showed that from Nebraska west, there wasn't enough rainfall for agriculture. He determined that through scientific study. And this is what led to the creation of the construction of many dams on the Colorado and other rivers. This was done by the federal government. The only reason there's water out west for people to drink in Phoenix, Arizona, and agriculture in California, all these places, is because of the federal government. The U.S. Bureau of Reclamation and the Army Corps of Engineers, because of what John Wesley Powell said, they built dams on these rivers and to make it possible for farming to take place, for settlement to take place out west. And there wouldn't even be a west as we know it if it weren't for the federal government and these studies. Now, I mentioned the assassination of President Garfield. What happened here was someone who wanted a job, a federal government job, was angry because he didn't get it, and he killed President Garfield. Now, this was an assassination. And it may seem strange to say this, but his assassination gave the final push to an effort that had been underway to try to create a federal civil service so that presidents wouldn't be making all these decisions like they were in the Jacksonian era. I mean, of course, we know that presidents do appoint several thousand people, but there's many, many, many thousands more, hundreds of thousands they don't appoint. And most of those people are getting their jobs through what we now call civil service. Employment is based on expertise, merit. The jobs are posted for anyone to apply for, competitive exams, educational qualifications, shielded from being involved or pressured in politics. So that's something called the Hatch Act. We'll talk about that briefly. And an agency with a mission. That mission, in the big picture, a lot of it has involved regulating economic activity or commerce. As corporations grew in this country and became very large in the late 1800s, the economy became very big and very complex, and a lot of people suffered from that. Many people benefited, of course, but other people suffered. There were unfair business practices that could not be regulated. There were things that we call externalities, which means where two people make a contract that has adverse effects for a third person who's not in the contract. And when that happens, I mean, how is it supposed to be solved? This is where government comes in. So, for example, if a railroad train is shipping people's goods down the railroad line and it throws up sparks and sets a farmer's field on fire, well, the farmer had nothing to do with this. The farmer didn't ship the goods. The farmer doesn't own the train. He has no control through the market. And so who's going to step in and do something about that and protect the farmer from having their field burned up by sparks or any other, or who's going to protect you against your neighbor turning their backyard into a hog farm or whatever. Doing things that affect you, that affect me, when we're not party to the contract. Well, the market can't fix that, and governments can. So government agencies began to come into existence at the federal level to regulate, for example, the rates that railroads were charging people, which were exorbitant, to protect small businesses from big businesses, and so forth. And then came the New Deal, which we have talked about, but briefly understand there was an enormous expansion of the federal government during the New Deal as social programs were created during the Depression to help those who were without work, etc., and the economic regulatory agencies to save the economy during the 1930s. And then along came World War II, and after that, the Great Society in the 1960s, and all these things have led to agencies being created to solve problems and to address needs. During the Great Society years of the 1960s, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Department of Transportation, later the Department of Education, and on and on and on. And they've all taken on specific tasks. The way this kind of works is that somebody becomes aware of a problem with something going on in the economy, Congress passes a law, the president signs it, the agency gets created. When the economy, our economy crashed in '08 and we had the Great Recession, people were being defrauded by banks. And clearly the banking industry had induced people to take out loans they could never pay back. Millions of people, and they lost their homes as a result. Well, we created a new agency, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, CFPB, and that was brought into existence to solve a problem. The agency can make rules, investigate violations of those rules, and in some cases they hold hearings. This is just the same process we just described. It happened in the 60s, it happened in the 30s, it happened in the 1800s. A problem comes along in the economy, Congress creates an agency to solve the problem or protect people. It's put in the executive branch, it's supervised by the president, and it's a bureaucracy, and it runs as we've been discussing. So basically, you get agencies. Most of these agencies have several functions. One is to make rules, which have the force of law. Another is to enforce those rules in the same agency, and then to have administrative adjudication, like mini trials, in the agency as well. So in the same agency, say the Department of Occupational Safety and Health, or OSHA. They make rules for the workplace, they cite people for violating the rules, and they have trials within the agency on whether they've violated the rules. So they make the rule, they enforce the rule, and they adjudicate the rule. And that's unusual. It's all in the same agency. So now let's talk about who's in the federal bureaucracy today, who these people are and how they're organized briefly. And I want to talk with you also about the Administrative Procedure Act. Why? Because this is the way rules get made. They are made pursuant to a law that was passed by Congress that says how they have to do it. And this is the process that I just described. Someone wants a regulation, so we have an agency, and someone wants a regulation. The agency drafts a regulation, it goes to the OMB for approval, it goes to the industry and interest groups, it's published, it's reviewed, and public comments and testimony are taken. A final draft is written. It has to be approved by OMB, Office of Management and Budget, again, and then it's published. Now, I don't expect you to become experts on this, but just understand, agencies, when they make these regulations, they have to do it pursuant to a law that governs them called the Administrative Procedure Act. Okay. Now, the agencies, the formal organization of the federal government involves various types of agencies. The four main types are, first, the cabinet departments, which are the most important, independent executive agencies, independent regulatory commissions, and government corporations. These are the main 15 departments of the federal government. We call that the cabinet. Sometimes we call those the cabinet agencies. Now, as I've mentioned, before, presidents don't necessarily hold, quote, cabinet meetings that often, but the cabinet agencies are the main departments of the federal government: state, treasury, defense, justice, interior, agriculture, commerce, labor, transportation, housing and urban development, health and human services, energy, education, Veterans Affairs, and Homeland Security. And that Homeland Security is the one that was created after 9/11, again, to meet a need. We weren't apparently responding in a coherent manner to the threat of terrorism and other threats to our security. And the thought was, let's create a department that knits them all together and coordinates them. And that's what Department of Homeland Security does. So I just want to give you some examples of these different types of agencies, that I just cited for you. The Executive Office of the President, remember we talked about that. The main departments, we just talked about that. Those are the cabinet agencies. Independent regulatory commissions would include the Federal Communications Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Environmental Protection Agency, the National Labor Relations Board. They have their own boards of directors. They are independent of direct government, direct presidential control. Then we have the government corporations. This is an enormous sector, very important sector, and it's hard to explain what they do. But they are government-sponsored or government-run corporations that do important things. Fannie Mae, for example, buys and securitizes home mortgages. The Tennessee Valley Authority basically brought electricity to the South. They need to operate a bit like business corporations because they interface with the business world, but they are supervised by government. And then there are independent agencies like NASA, that shoots our rockets into space, the Federal Reserve, the National Banking System, the Federal Emergency Management Authority, Social Security Administration. These are independent agencies that have a task, and they are not directly controlled by the president. All these agencies now are, another thing about them is they are divided up into territorial jurisdictions. These are regions. So we are in Region 5 here in Chicago, and there are all these different regions around the country. And so typically these main federal agencies have branch offices in all the regions. This is, I think, an important point that I'd really like you to take note of. This is the number of federal employees. I just got this data, so it's current. And this is from the Federal Reserve, by the way. The Federal Reserve of St. Louis maintains a lot of data. You can look it up yourself. It's called FRED. This comes from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. All right, it's the number of federal employees. Now, most Americans think that we're getting more and more, quote, bureaucrats every day. This is not true. If you look at this, you can see that we have almost the same number of 2.8 million of federal employees that we had in the late 1960s. So the number of federal employees, even though we have more people in the country, we have the same number of federal employees, about 2.8 million. You'll see spikes every 10 years. You see those little spikes? That's the census. They hire a lot of census workers every 10 years. But aside from those spikes, basically it stayed essentially the same. So is the federal government, if you see a question on the exam, is the federal government growing in terms of number of federal employees? The answer is no. The budget has gone up, yes, but the number of employees has not. These employees are classified into groups. 40% of them are administrative employees. So, there's a lot of things to do: payroll, training, etc., human resources. Many are professionals. A huge number of them are professionals. Lawyers. A lot of lawyers work for the federal government. Nurses, etc. Technical people. A lot of them are scientists. Chemists, etc. Many are blue-collar workers, janitors, etc. There are many just, basically just clerical people who do all the data entry, filling in documents, answering the phone, and so forth. And then there, of course, are, firefighters, prison guards, etc. The salaries that they pay, now, I'd like to point out to you that, the salaries vary. Usually, for, let's take a professional person, usually the salary for, let's say, a lawyer, if we took lawyers as a professional group, the salary that they're paid in the federal government will not be as high as the highest or even the above median for the private employees doing the same job. But it is more secure, and there are more pension benefits and so forth. So the salaries are not huge, but they try to be as competitive as they can. What you will see if you look at this, though, is that look at the agencies. Where do they work? See, there's all the 15 agencies that or departments of the federal government. Which has the most? Well, look who's got the most people working for them. Veterans Affairs, the Army, the Navy, Homeland Security. They have hundreds of thousands of employees. Defense and law enforcement related employment is the bulk of the federal workforce. Like 2/3 of it. 2/3 of the federal workforce is basically, and these are civilians. This is not the, when I say Army and Navy, that does not mean the soldiers. If we look at the military agencies, you can see that they're divided up, and they have hundreds of thousands of civilian employees, but they also have their enlisted. So that's aside from that. I'm speaking of the civilian employees. So point is, this is the end of this presentation, but I just want you to understand before we go into the next presentation, the next video on bureaucracy, that what the federal government does is a set of tasks that it has been asked to do by economic actors, by corporations, by banks, etc., or by civilians. The agencies have been created one at a time to meet needs, and the notion that they're huge and wasteful and throwing money away is very questionable, because the budget is allocated, the money that they spend and the people they're allowed to hire. This is all strictly allocated according to principles. They have functions. These agencies have functions. They have things that they're supposed to do, and they try to do those things to the best of their ability. Most of the people who work in these agencies, whether it be the veterans agencies or commerce or whatever the department might be, are dedicated to the mission of that agency, and they want to see that agency do a good job. Is there waste and fraud? Yeah, it does happen, but it's not the norm. The norm is that the U.S. federal bureaucracy is honest. It is not growing in terms of numbers of employees. It is largely competent, and so I think the notion that we should look down on, quote, bureaucracy is a questionable one. Instead, we should probably try to understand what the agencies do, and try to help them do it better. So in the next presentation, we'll go into this whole question of how bureaucracies are held accountable, and a bit more about the details of the rulemaking process with an example that I'm going to show you. And that concludes this presentation.